I was boiling water over a camping stove in my backyard, the faint hiss of the flame cutting through the chaos that had engulfed the neighborhood. Across the street, my neighbors screamed from their rooftops, their voices sharp with panic as they shouted about a gas line explosion that had just torn through the block. The air smelled of scorched asphalt and fear, and while everyone else scrambled in the dark, powerless, hungry, and exposed, I sat calmly under my canopy, the only one with shelter, electricity, and food. Why? Because 2 weeks ago, Karen, the self-appointed queen of our cul-de-sac, had my camper towed from my driveway, leaving me no choice but to adapt. And now, here I was, the last man standing in a crisis she'd indirectly set in motion. If you're wondering how things spiraled this far, it didn't begin with explosions or rooftop refugees. It started with a smile, not a kind one, but the thin-lipped, dead-eyed grin of a woman who wielded a beige clipboard like a scepter and thought she ruled the world because she chaired the HOA board. Her name was Karen, naturally, and she'd made it her mission to purge our quiet little street of anything she deemed an eyesore, which unfortunately included my camper. The camper wasn't just some junk on wheels, it was my lifeline. I'd bought it after my wife passed, a quiet woman who dreamed of exploring national parks, deserts, and coastlines together. After her funeral, I was lost, drifting through days with no purpose, so I sold our second car, picked up a modest towable camper, and started hitting the road every few months. It gave me solitude, a way to breathe, a tether to her memory. And when I wasn't traveling, it sat neatly on the right side of my driveway, no mess, no clutter, just a clean white box minding its own business. But Karen didn't see a grieving man's sanctuary. She saw a blight on her Stepford fantasy, a threat to the pristine uniformity she enforced with evangelical zeal. The trouble began with a note taped to the camper's door. No envelope, no hello, just a sterile printout in 12-point Times New Roman declaring that per HOA guidelines, all recreational vehicles had to be stored out of sight. I'd read those guidelines front to back when I moved in, though, and Section 3, Paragraph 2 clearly stated that RVs could stay in driveways if they were operational and not lived in full time. Mine was pristine and road-ready, so I taped a polite, factual rebuttal right under her note. Karen didn't take kindly to being challenged. 3 days later, she escalated, patrolling the street on her walks, phone out, snapping photos of my camper like it was a wanted felon. One evening, I caught her crouching by my mailbox, angling for a shot of the license plate. I waved, she didn't wave back, just scurried off like a thief caught mid-crime. I tried reasoning with her once, asking if there was a specific issue we could resolve. She flashed that tight smile and said, "Rules are rules. If we let one camper stay, what's next? Boats, chicken coops." She spat chicken coops like it was a curse, and soon after, a formal violation notice landed in my mailbox. No fine yet, just a warning. I decided to fight it at the next HOA meeting, figuring a calm explanation from a reasonable adult would sort it out. Big mistake. The meeting was a sterile, fluorescent-lit farce in the clubhouse. 5 polo-shirted board members perched at a folding table like a budget congress, Karen at the helm. I brought photos, a highlighted copy of the bylaws, even oatmeal raisin cookies as a peace offering. She called it bribery and shut me down before I could finish. Karen wasn't there to listen. She was there to win. As I laid out my case at the HOA meeting, how my camper was registered, maintained, and only parked in my driveway between trips, she barely glanced at my evidence. Instead, she pulled out a folder like a prosecutor in a bad courtroom drama, unveiling a stack of photos she'd taken of my camper, zoomed in and framed for maximum ugliness, probably tweaked in some filter app for extra effect. She proposed an emergency motion to rewrite the rules, banning all RVs from driveways effective immediately. No homeowner vote, just her little clique of clipboard loyalists nodding in sync. "You have 72 hours to remove it," she said, eyes gleaming with triumph, "or we'll have it towed." I stared at her, the weight of her pettiness sinking in, and said, "You're making a mistake." She tilted her head, smirking. "No, you made one when you parked that eyesore here." Outmaneuvered, I couldn't afford the fines they'd pile on, so I arranged to move the camper to a storage lot 10 miles away, where, of course, they jacked up the rates during peak season. I paid it, gritted my teeth, thought of my wife and the trips we'd never take, and told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But I didn't let it go, not really. I started watching, listening, taking mental notes. Corinne's solar garden lights flickered weakly at night. The HOA had banned backup generators after a noise complaint years back. No one had rained barrels because they attracted mosquitoes. Meanwhile, the city had been doing maintenance on gas lines nearby for months, notices ignored in overstuffed mailboxes. I wasn't paranoid, just spiteful, so I prepped. A small generator stashed at my brother, legal amounts of fuel stored off-site, a bug-out box with canned food and water. When the HOA began backyard inspections for unsightly emergency gear, I dug in deeper. I was done playing nice. Let Corinne have her manicured lawns and beige empire. When it all fell apart, I'd be ready. 2 weeks later, it did. On the hottest day of the year, the street groaned, literally like a beast waking up. A hiss, a roar, then an explosion, not catastrophic, but enough to rupture a gas main and send a 6-foot plume of fire shooting from the curb across the street. Emergency crews shut off the gas. Power died an hour later, water pressure dwindled to nothing, and by nightfall, indoor temperatures hit 90 degrees. People spilled into their yards, sweating and dazed. Corinne tried to organize with a lantern, laminated guidelines, and a whistle, but no one cared. I rolled out my canopy, fired up the camping stove, and started boiling water, savoring the irony. Then I heard her voice, frantic, no clipboard in sight, yelling from my driveway's edge. "There's a gas leak near my property line. It's getting worse. They're evacuating the east row." Her eyes were wild as she looked at my setup, my calm, and said, "Can I stay here with you?" I didn't answer, not yet, because something else caught my eye, a small red light blinking under the cracked pavement near her mailbox, pulsing like a warning. My mind raced, old wiring, a gas sensor, a utility marker. But whatever it wasn't good, and it wasn't my problem. Not after she'd made ruining my peace her personal crusade. I turned back to my stove, lifted the kettle, and poured myself a cup of instant coffee with deliberate calm. Corinne stood there, mouth agape, expecting me to play savior after she'd orchestrated my camper's exile. 2 weeks ago, she'd watched it get towed. No heads up, just a smug smirk as it rolled away, a new HOA rule taped to my garage. I'd come home to an oil stain and her weeding her roses like nothing happened. Standards, she'd called it, not petty power. The memory of that tow truck still burned as I sipped my coffee, the neighborhood unraveling around me. Corinne had moved fast, impressively so, when it came to flexing her HOA muscle. After the camper was hauled off, I'd called the number on the violation notice, wadding through an hour of hold music to learn it was at a secure lot, which meant expensive. Daily storage fees, towing costs, admin charges, and a fine for breaking an emergency ordinance passed just 3 days earlier. When I'd asked Corinne if she felt better with it gone, she'd smiled that saccharine smile and said, "It's not about feeling better, it's about maintaining standards." That word, standards, echoed now as I watched her, sweaty and disheveled, her perfect lawn singed from the gas flare, her useless solar lights dark, her decorative lanterns just pretty shells. She built a life on appearances, not resilience, and now she was crumbling under the weight of her own hollow rules. I'd spent the week after the tow prepping in silence. Tent, fuel, water jugs, batteries, food, a foldable solar panel, all stashed at the storage unit. I wasn't just ready for this blackout, I'd half expected it while everyone else mocked my caution. That first night post-explosion was brutal. Sirens wailed, emergency services focused on bigger fires, our block a low-priority mess. By midnight, neighbors roamed with flashlights, hunting for a signal or news. Some tried driving out only to find roads closed for safety checks. We were trapped, powerless, except me. Come morning, I woke in my shaded tent, fan whirring, water cool, brewing oatmeal and coffee while others melted in the heat. Neighbors trickled over, first curious, then desperate, asking for phone chargers or water. I helped quietly, no gloating, but Corinne didn't reappear until late afternoon, looking worse, hair wild, skin red, voice raspy. She offered a sheepish help, the closest she'd get to an apology, then asked for supplies like it was a casual favor. "What happened to your emergency kit?" I asked. She blinked. "I didn't think we'd need one." That hit me, the neighborhood's whole facade, the rules, the newsletters, all cosmetic, no substance. Corinne had obsessed over lawn heights and mailbox colors, never prepping for reality. I didn't refuse her outright. I said I'd think about it, letting her stew in the uncertainty she'd once wielded against me. That night more neighbors came by, trading canned goods for batteries, first aid for ice, even a bottle of wine, community forming raw and real, stripped of HOA polish. Karen lingered on her porch, a dethroned queen watching her kingdom fray. Day 2 brought worse. The city said gas would stay off for 5 days, power rerouting had no ETA, and evacuation was advised. But roads stayed blocked, fuel rationed, and the heat soared past 105. Tensions spiked, fights over water at the corner store, the HOA's megaphone meeting in the cul-de-sac ignored as Karen barked orders no one heeded. That afternoon, I had my camper hauled back, thanks to a friend with a flatbed, parking it right where it had been, generator humming, AC purring. Karen's face as it rolled in was priceless, her mouth twitching like she wanted to cite bylaws that no longer mattered in this disaster zone. I'd cleared it with a city inspector earlier. Being the block's only prepared resident made me useful, so I opened the windows, let the smell of hot food drift out. Neighbors came not just for aid but gratitude, bringing kids, sharing stories under the awning, connection I'd never felt here before. Then Karen approached again, this time with a city official, badge gleaming, clipboard in hand. My stomach sank as he eyed my camper, scribbling something. "You're in violation again," she said, smug. "Temporary emergency doesn't mean you can break codes." The official cut in. "Actually, we're here about a complaint, illegal fuel storage on this property. We need to look." It wasn't mine, I kept fuel off-site, but Karen's pettiness had struck again. The inspector's words hung heavy as Karen stood behind him, arms folded, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. She'd found a new angle to hit me with, even amidst the chaos. It was almost admirable, her relentless spite, but I wasn't rattled. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, weary, probably exhausted from non-stop calls. I gestured broadly to my yard. "Be my guest. If you find illegal fuel, I'll eat my camper." He trudged off to inspect while Karen hovered, watching me like she expected me to crack. I walked beside him, pointing out my solar setup, water storage, all legal, receipts laminated and ready. He checked the camper's redeployment papers, nodded, then asked, "No fuel stored here at all?" "Nope," I said. "It's off-site, unlike some. I read the rules." Karen squawked, "Check the shed. He's hiding something. It smells like chemicals." The inspector raised an eyebrow. I shrugged. "Gardening tools and paint cans, go ahead, it's a mess." Inside the sun-warped shed, rusty tools, a broken chair, half-used paint, ant traps, no fuel, nothing hazardous. He stepped out. "Seems in order. Sorry for the hassle." I grinned at Karen, some panic when they're not in control. Her face twisted, but she stormed off without a word. The inspector muttered, "You're doing more for this block than emergency services. Don't let M get you." Too late. I thought Karen had gotten under my skin weeks ago, but I thanked him as he left. The sun sank, heat unrelenting, air thick with burnt plastic and exhaustion. Neighbors slumped, voices hushed. They were fraying. That night my generator hummed as I cooked rice and beans. A few joined me under the awning, a grim parody of camping with garbage stench replacing pine. Karen's house glowed faintly with candles. She'd bragged about them once, but they couldn't mask the swelter inside. Day 3 dawned worse. A water main burst near the entrance, cutting off our trickle entirely. No city workers in sight, blackout persisting, tempers boiling over. 2 houses down, a shouting match turned ugly over hoarded water. Someone chucked a lawn gnome, civility shattered over a case of Dasani. I watched from afar, crisis peels back the veneer, and these potluck-posting neighbors were now bartering batteries like warlords. Karen tried rallying them again. A unity meeting in her driveway, 3 showed up, 2 kids. Her voice droned about a recovery committee and resource registration. No one cared. They needed help, not her bureaucracy. That evening she appeared at my door, not knocking, just standing there, pale, trembling, sweat-slicked. "I need help," she croaked. "Water, a compress, my daughter's visiting, she's faint from the heat." I didn't know she had a kid, and part of me wondered if it was a trick, but her swaying, the way her hands clenched, felt real. I handed her a water bottle silently. She took it, eyes down, whispering, "Thank you," before shuffling off. No victory, no smugness, just fatigue. Revenge shouldn't feel this draining. I'd won, hadn't I? Camper back, safe, supplied, but the thrill was gone. That night a dry electric wind kicked up, ozone-tinged, unnerving. The forecast said nothing, but it felt like a storm holding its breath. Sleep eluded me, the wind rattling the camper. Past midnight, a sharp pop, not gas, maybe a transformer, lit the sky blue, then black. I stepped outside, far off, an orange glow flickered beyond the hills. A fire not here yet, but close. Grabbing my radio, I spotted something new. Red and blue lights flashing silently by Karen's fence, a police cruiser and utility truck. There she was, arms flailing, arguing, crying, then pointing at my house. I froze, half amused, half braced. She'd snapped, or she was spinning one last tale to drag me down. Either way, I wasn't waiting to find out. I grabbed my documents and headed over. Karen was a silhouette in the emergency lights, her voice pitching wildly as I approached, gesturing like a conductor gone mad. The utility worker leaned against his truck board while the officer tried to calm her. "There he is," she shrieked, spotting me. "He's the one stockpiling. I've seen people with gas cans. I swear it's illegal. He's endangering us." She looked feral, sweaty, twitchy, unhinged. I handed the officer my folder, receipts, off-site fuel agreements, camper authorization, and said evenly, "Fuel stored legally off-site. People she's seen, neighbors getting food and water because no one else was ready." He skimmed the papers, face neutral, then handed them back. "Checks out. We're not here to cite anyone, just checking a fire risk along the property line." He pointed to the woods behind Karen's house, where that orange glow was sharpening. "Brush fire 2 miles out, gaining speed, winds aren't helping, prepare for possible evacuation." Karen's bravado collapsed. "Evacuation? Where? The roads are blocked." "Working on a corridor," he said, "but maybe not tonight, shelter in place till morning." She turned to me, voice small. "You have a vehicle, you can get out." I didn't reply, just walked back, heart pounding, not from her but the fire. A wildfire in this heat with dry grass and no resources wasn't a shock, but being trapped as it closed in was. I packed, stove secured, supplies bundled, generator, fuel checked. Neighbors drifted over. Tracy, who'd helped with the awning, asked if I had room. I made a call, opened the camper fully, told families needing real shelter, no drama, no Karen, to come in. Word spread. Soon, 3 families with kids crammed inside, fans whirring, solar lights glowing. We cooked, listened to the radio, smoke faint in the vents, while Karen watched from my driveway's edge, silent, her pristine house dimming as candles guttered. Her lawn, once her crown jewel, was patchy, her power, literal and figurative, spent. Thunder rumbled, dry and rainless, the wind whispering of danger. The radio crackled, fire contained barely, but embers had jumped a ridge, evacuation delayed by fallen trees. We were stuck till dawn. At 3 a.m., a soft knock, Karen, defeated, eyes hollow. "My daughter," she whispered. "She's struggling to breathe, the heat, I don't know what to do." Behind her, a pale teen leaned on the porch, panting. I didn't want Karen near my space, built from grief and defiance, but I wasn't cruel. I stepped aside, the girl stumbled in, got water, a cloth, sat under the fan, her breathing eased, relief flushing her face. "Thank you," she murmured. To me, not Karen, who stayed outside like a specter till morning. Dawn brought the evacuation route, fire partially contained, a city shuttle rolling through for those without cars. I helped the families pack, loaded my truck to follow when an official handed me a notice, a commendation. Neighbors had reported my aid, shelter, supplies, safety during the crisis. The city had noticed. My camper, now a mobile emergency unit, was authorized to stay, HOA rules overridden, and they'd launched an investigation into the board for neglecting preparedness laws. I nearly laughed. Karen, by her dying roses, looked petrified. Days later, the HOA held an emergency election under pressure. Karen was ousted unanimously. I didn't run, didn't need to. The neighborhood was shifting without me pushing. Power returned, gas lines fixed, streets cleared, people talked again, real talk, not HOA fluff. Karen vanished from the Facebook group, stopped her patrols, quietly listed her house. Revenge, they say, is best served cold, but sometimes it's a hot coffee over your camping stove while those who tried to crush you watch you lead the community they couldn't. I never wanted to be a hero, just wanted peace, a quiet life to grieve. But sometimes life gives you what you need, and if you're lucky, the last word. The commendation from the city felt surreal as I stood there, truck keys in hand, watching the shuttle pull away with the last of the evacuated families. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a quiet vindication, a middle finger to the HOA's petty tyranny, and proof that preparation trumped Karen's clipboard crusade. The official had been matter-of-fact, mentioning how my setup, camper, generator, supplies, had kept people safe when the neighborhood's so-called leaders floundered. The investigation into the HOA board was the cherry on top. Whispers of neglected emergency statutes had already started circulating, and Karen's reign was imploding faster than her scorched lawn. She stood there, motionless beside her wilted roses, as if the weight of her own irrelevance had finally pinned her in place. I didn't gloat, didn't have the energy, just climbed into my truck and followed the shuttle out, the camper trailing behind me like a loyal dog, its hum a reminder of everything I'd held onto despite her. The evacuation corridor was a narrow lifeline through chaos, roads still littered with debris, the air thick with the acrid tang of smoke from that brush fire, now barely contained a few miles off. I drove slow, watching families clutch what little they'd salvaged, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. The city had set up a temporary shelter at a community center 10 miles out, and by the time I arrived, the place buzzed with cots, bottled water, and the low hum of portable generators, not unlike mine. I didn't stay long, just dropped off a few extra supplies, water jugs, a spare fan, and headed back. The neighborhood wasn't safe yet, but it was still mine, and I wasn't about to abandon it completely. When I rolled back in, the street was eerily quiet. No sirens, no shouting, just the faint crackle of dry leaves skittering in the wind. Corinne's house was dark, no candles flickering now, and I wondered if she'd fled with her daughter or was still holed up inside, clinging to the last scraps of her control. Power crept back online a few days later, flickering at first, then steady. Gas lines followed, repaired with a slowness that spoke to the city's stretched resources. The streets got swept, garbage hauled off, and people emerged from their homes like survivors of a siege, blinking in the daylight. Conversations started up, not the HOA scripted pleasantries, but real ones about what they'd lost, what they'd learned, how they'd make it through next time. Corinne's absence was palpable. She'd vanished from her usual haunts. No more morning walks with her phone out, no more sanctimonious posts on the HOA Facebook group. Word spread she'd put her house up for sale, a discreet for sale sign popping up by her mailbox, no fanfare, no farewell. The emergency election had sealed her fate. Unanimous vote to boot her off the board, no one stepping up to defend her after her flailing attempts at leadership during the crisis. I didn't run for a seat. I didn't need to. The neighborhood was shedding its old skin without my prodding, and I was fine just watching it happen. I kept the camper in my driveway, no longer a target but a fixture, its presence a quiet rebellion against the old rules. Neighbors waved now, not the stiff, performative kind, but genuine nods of recognition. Some even stopped by to chat, asking about my setup, how I'd known to prep. I didn't preach, just shrugged and said I'd rather be ready than sorry. The truth was simpler. Spite had driven me at first, a slow burn from Corinne's smug tow truck victory, but it had morphed into something else, resilience, maybe even purpose. I'd wanted peace, a space to grieve my wife and rebuild, but life had handed me a different script and I'd played it out. Corinne's downfall wasn't my doing, she'd built her own pyre, but sipping coffee from my stove while she faded into irrelevance. That was a win I hadn't expected, and it tasted damn good. The neighborhood's transformation unfolded quietly in the days after the power returned, like a plant breaking through cracked pavement. People didn't just rebuild, they rethought. The HOA, once a petty fiefdom under Corinne's reign, was now a ghost of itself. The investigation into its failures had stripped away its authority, and no one seemed eager to resurrect it. Meetings stopped, newsletters ceased, and the Facebook group turned into a free-for-all of practical tips, where to get generator parts, how to store water, rather than Corinne's old edicts about mailbox uniformity. Her house stayed on the market, unsold, a beige monument to her collapse, its windows dark and its lawn creeping toward neglect. I'd see her occasionally, slipping out to her car or retrieving mail, head down, no eye contact, her queenly strut gone, replaced by the shuffle of someone who'd lost more than just a title. I didn't pity her, but I didn't hate her either. She dug her own grave with that clipboard, and I was too tired to dance on it. My camper became a sort of neighborhood beacon, not flashy, just there, a practical symbol of what worked when everything else failed. Kids would bike past and point, their parents trailing behind with shy smiles, sometimes asking if I'd show them how to set up a solar panel or maintain a stove. I'd oblige not because I wanted a spotlight, but because it felt right, less about proving a point and more about paying forward what I'd learned. Tracy, the woman who'd helped with the awning, started a small co-op, pooling resources for emergencies. Others joined, trading skills and supplies, a grassroots thing born from necessity, not bylaws. I chipped in, some spare batteries, a few tricks for stretching fuel, content to stay on the edges. The city's commendation hung in my camper, unframed, a quiet nod to what I'd done, but I didn't flaunt it. It was enough that the HOA couldn't touch me anymore, that my little patch of driveway was mine again. Nights were the best part, Cooler now, the heat wave broken, I'd sit under the awning with a mug of coffee, the stoves flame a soft flicker in the dark. The stars were sharper without Karen's flickering solar lights cluttering the view, and the silence was real, not the tense kind that had blanketed the block during the blackout. I'd think about my wife sometimes, how she'd have loved this. The camper, the road trips we never took, even this strange victory over petty tyranny. The grief was still there, a dull ache, but it had company now, a sense of steadiness I hadn't felt since she'd gone. I wasn't a hero, didn't want to be, just a guy who'd kept going, who'd turned Karen's spite into something useful. The neighborhood didn't need me to lead it. It was finding its own way, and I was fine with that, happy to sip my coffee and let the world turn. Karen's exit was the final punctuation. One morning, a moving truck rumbled in unmarked, no fuss, and by dusk her house was empty, the for sale sign still swaying faintly in the breeze. No one knew where she went. Rumors said she'd moved to an apartment downtown or maybe out of state with her daughter. Either way, she was gone and the cul-de-sac exhaled. I didn't throw a party or toast her departure, didn't need to. The real celebration was in the everyday. Neighbors chatting over fences, kids playing without curfew lectures, a block that felt alive instead of policed. I'd wanted peace, a quiet life to mourn and rebuild, and I'd gotten it. Not how I'd planned, but maybe better. Life doesn't always give you what you ask for. Sometimes it hands you a camping stove, a crisis, and a chance to come out on top, and that I figured was close enough. Karen's departure left a void that didn't need filling. The neighborhood thrived without her, like a garden after a weed been yanked. The HOA didn't recover. The investigation had gutted it, exposing years of neglected preparedness for the sake of petty aesthetics, and no one cared to prop it back up. Her empty house sat there, a beige shell with a sagging "for sale" sign, its silence louder than her old whistle-blowing rants. People moved on, literally some of them, selling up after the crisis exposed how fragile their perfect lawns were. But most stayed, tougher for it, swapping stories of the blackout like war veterans. My camper stayed put, no longer a battleground but a fixture, its white siding catching the morning sun as I brewed coffee on the stove. Neighbors didn't just wave now. They'd linger, ask about my trips, share their own plans, real connections, not the HOA's forced cheer. I'd nod, listen, keep it simple. Peace was all I'd wanted, and I'd found it, not in solitude, but in this quiet, earned belonging. The city never forgot either. A few weeks later, a local paper ran a blurb about my mobile emergency unit, quoting the commendation and a couple neighbors who'd called me a lifeline, Tracy's words mostly, bless her. I didn't seek it out, didn't clip it, just tucked the paper in a drawer and let it be. The camper's official status stuck, though no HOA could touch it now, and the new block mentality didn't care to try. Tracy's co-op grew, a practical network of shared generators and water caches, and I'd pitch in when asked, advice mostly or a spare can of fuel, happy to stay a cog, not the wheel. Nights under the awning became routine, coffee in hand, the stoves hum a steady pulse against the dark. I'd think of my wife, her dreams of deserts and coastlines, and how this camper had carried me through grief and spite into something solid. Maybe not the life she'd pictured, but one she'd have been proud of. Karen's ghost lingered in small ways. Her rose bushes, half dead, still lined her old yard. A faded HOA notice fluttered from someone's mailbox, ignored. No one spoke her name much, but her absence shaped things, a reminder of what happens when control trumps community. I saw her once, months later, at a gas station downtown, thinner, quieter, loading boxes into a sedan. She didn't see me, and I didn't call out. Whatever fight we did was ash now, burned out with the crisis. Back home, the cul-de-sac kept evolving. Kids built a makeshift skate ramp. Adults traded tools instead of gossip, and the air felt lighter, unburdened by her shadow. I didn't lead it, didn't need to. The block had found its spine, and I was just one part of it, content with my stove and my solitude. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold, but mine came hot, steaming from a kettle while Karen watched her world unravel. I hadn't planned it, hadn't wanted to be the guy who saved the day, just a widower who'd refused to bend. Life didn't give me the quiet I'd chased. It gave me chaos, a camper, and a front row seat to her downfall. Sometimes that's enough. The last word wasn't a shout or a speech. It was the soft clink of my mug on the camper table, the murmur of neighbors laughing across the street, the block alive and mine again. I'd rebuilt, not alone but alongside them, and as I sipped that coffee, tasting the bitter edge of victory, I figured my wife would have smiled. Sometimes you don't get what you want, you get what you need, and if you're lucky, it's sweeter than you'd ever planned.